Welcome to another lecture segment. This one is covering bias in research and how to avoid bias in your own writing. We're going to look at what bias is, how to identify bias in sources, and then how to avoid bias in your writing. Very important. Bias is likely a term you've heard thrown around at some point in general conversation. A lot of times you'll hear it used when someone's bragging about their child's accomplishments. Oh, he's doing awesome this season in track, but then again, it might be that I am biased. According to Webster's dictionary, bias is first listed as a line going diagonally across a grain of fabric. If you want to think abstractly, this works as we all have our own viewpoints that slant how we see things. With this definition, you can think of bias as an idea that slants your perspective. Another meaning is that bias is an unfair act or policy stemming from prejudice. While this is certainly a type of bias that does crop up from time to time in sources and in writing, it's a little easier to spot due to the tone the writer would take on the topic. In general conversation, it can be easy to see when a prejudice is keeping another person from hearing our view on a topic. The same can be true of writing. The final definition is where we'll put most of our focus for this segment, though I may use some of the others to help illustrate a point. The final definition for bias is a preference or an inclination, especially one that inhibits impartial judgment. It inhibits impartial judgment. As this last meaning can be trickier to spot in academic sources and writing, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the definition of bias. If someone has a preference for something, they're more likely to choose that option despite there being better options available. This is because they no longer have an impartial judgment. This would be the case of a parent bragging about a child getting second place in the race. There was clearly a first place runner. However, because it wasn't their child, they want instead to focus on their child's accomplishment. Is this wrong? Absolutely not. I do it all the time. Is it wrong when it comes to academic writing? It could be. Why? Because being biased in academic writing could mean that you're overlooking key facts and data that are important to the topic. Does it happen? All the time, even with professionals who are published in peer-reviewed sources. Sometimes these facts are overlooked on purpose because the author doesn't want to admit that there's another side that could be right. But most often, it's an omission based on ignorance of the data. Now, this doesn't mean that the researcher is stupid. On the contrary, it takes a certain type of intelligence to research anything as thoroughly as the top experts do. However, it only takes one oversight to miss a piece of data. This means that the researcher is ignorant or in the dark about a fact or piece of data that could shape the topic of their research. How can you tell if the author is biased, whether by choice or not? Start by asking yourself if they're looking at all angles of the topic. If they've overlooked a study, a key piece of information, or are writing in the tone that implies bias, the source might not be as strong as you think. And you'll have to evaluate the source more in depth to see what's missing or left out. Remember that some of what is left out could be unintentional. This means that the researcher didn't think to probe that deeply into the oppositional information, likely due to the fact that they were not as impartial as they had thought, or they didn't think to examine that particular angle. It didn't occur to them. They had a preference, and they followed that preference without considering all of the other options. It does happen, even to the best of us. This type of bias, the omission of data, is the most common form of bias in research writing and in sources. The best way to go about identifying bias in a source and even in your own writing is to probe deeper. Ask yourself why every time there's a point raised in the article. For example, massage is not considered a medical necessity and as such is not covered by insurance. Okay, why isn't it deemed a necessity? Is it a necessity? If it is, why is it? How does this help from a medical standpoint? What medical benefits are there to massage? In short, when you're attempting to identify bias, you actually want to explore the little rabbit holes of questions that arise while you are reading. These questions can lead you to further explore your topic and even to find avenues that have yet to be explored at all by anyone. The questions you have when you are reading are important because they are your connection to the research and they're your way of probing further into your topic. They are also how you poke holes in someone else's research. Of course, to do that with complete mastery, you have to find the answers to the questions that you are posing by locating solid sources with the data to back up those answers. Which leads us to how you can avoid bias in your own writing. You want to use the same tools and techniques. You want to ask questions of your own ideas and follow the rabbit holes. There's one drawback to this method. You are already biased on your topic. After all, you already have a personalized viewpoint on the subject. So then, how do we get around this bias? We have outsiders read our writing. This is part of where peer review workshops come into play. Now, anyone can peer review a piece they agree with and do so with tact. But it's much harder to peer review in a nice way a paper we don't agree with. And yet, those are the peer reviews that can do us the most good because those are the people most likely to poke holes in your paper and point out questions that you had never considered before. In addition to this, they are also the ones you are attempting to sway to your viewpoint. For someone of the opposing view to give you a tactfully done peer review, as in they're not turning it into a full-blown argument, they're not belittling your viewpoints, and they are only really pointing out ideas that you may not have considered before without it being turned into some sort of a political argument. This type of review is actually a blessing to your writing. It tells you where your bias might be and what new ideas or concepts you might need to examine in order to fix that bias. Again, this is only if the peer review is done tactfully by pointing out ideas that you might have missed your first go around. I hope that you found this information about source bias and avoiding bias in your own writing helpful. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, do not hesitate to reach out using that email icon in your learning management system. Thanks so much, and I'll catch you on the flip side.